Lady Almina Wombwell had never expected her life to unfold the way it did, and yet in every drawing-room of Edwardian society her name was whispered with a strange mix of admiration, envy, and suspicion. Born the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, one of the wealthiest men in England, she grew up in an odd place between privilege and exclusion. On one hand, money surrounded her, money that paid for silk gowns, tutors, and extravagant holidays. On the other, she was constantly reminded that she was not legitimate, and not a true Rothschild in the eyes of England's rigid aristocracy. Her mother, Marie Wombwell, guided her with sharp precision, determined that Almina would carve her way into the highest ranks of society. From her earliest years, Almina carried herself with a mixture of pride and hunger, desperate to prove that she belonged to a world that only partly accepted her. When she was still quite young, Alfred de Rothschild promised that he would provide her with a fortune upon marriage, a dowry so large that no nobleman could resist. In that time, aristocratic families were often crumbling under financial strain. Great estates were falling apart, filled with grandeur but lacking the funds to maintain them. To such families, a wealthy bride was not simply a blessing but a salvation. So when George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, met Almina, the match seemed both convenient and necessary. He was a man who adored luxury and adventure, but whose vast estate, Highclere Castle, was drowning in debt. To secure Almina meant securing the Rothschild wealth, even if her parentage made whispers circle at society dinners. Their marriage in 1895 was a dazzling event, described in newspapers as one of the grand unions of the age, a blending of money and title that embodied the very essence of Edwardian social machinery. Highclere Castle, with its towering Gothic spires and vast rooms, became Almina's new home. Walking through its corridors, she felt both awe and unease. The castle was magnificent, but behind its stone walls hung the constant reminder of financial desperation. Servants bustled through rooms whose tapestries were fading, and gardens that once hosted grand parties had grown wild. Her husband, while charming in public, was reckless in private. He had a passion for gambling, racing cars, and extravagant expeditions. He could not resist risk, and his finances reflected it. The fortune Alfred de Rothschild had given his daughter did not simply add to the Carnarvon wealth. It became the lifeline that kept Highclere from ruin. From the start, Almina understood that her role as wife was not just about companionship, but about survival. She had bought her way into aristocracy, and she would have to defend her position fiercely. Her beauty and confidence quickly made her a figure of fascination. At parties, men lingered near her, attracted by her wit as much as her fortune. Women studied her gowns with envy, whispering judgments about her origins, about her father's reputation, about whether she would ever truly be one of them. Almina ignored these whispers with practiced grace, but inside she carried a growing frustration. She had wealth, she had title, but she remained on the edge of acceptance. In such a world, appearances were everything, and secrets were currency. She began to realize that power did not always lie in money or title, but in the things society tried to hide. She listened carefully when ladies spoke in hushed tones of their private struggles, their fears of scandal, their shameful predicaments that could not be shared in daylight. It was in these hidden corners of conversation that Almina discovered an opportunity that would later define her life in ways no one could have foreseen. London was changing at the turn of the century. Medicine was advancing, but society's rules had not caught up. For women, especially those who strayed outside the confines of marriage or found themselves burdened by unwanted pregnancies, the options were cruelly limited. Respectable doctors turned them away, and hospitals refused to treat them. Rumors traveled quickly of small, secretive clinics hidden in the poorer districts, places where desperate women went when they had nowhere else to turn. Many of these women never returned alive. It was whispered that Lady Almina, curious and sympathetic, began to ask questions about these places. She was fascinated by the hidden world of medicine and scandal, drawn both by compassion and by the thrill of the forbidden. She was not content to be merely a decorative figure in the aristocracy. She wanted influence, she wanted meaning, and she wanted a way to remind others that she was not to be dismissed. At Hickler, she created a reputation as a benefactress, donating money to hospitals, supporting wounded veterans, and establishing herself as a woman of philanthropy. Newspapers praised her charitable work, and yet behind these glowing articles lay another truth. Some of the funds she directed were whispered to have found their way into less respectable causes. Certain doctors in London's East End, known for their discretion and secrecy, seemed to operate with unusual financial stability despite their reputation for taking on cases others refused. Almina's involvement was never written in public record, but letters preserved in private collections hint at her name appearing in connection with certain payments, certain arrangements. Whether she acted out of compassion for women trapped in impossible situations, or whether she saw in these shadows a way to command power, no one could say. But from the beginning, her life at Hickler was touched by secrets that could not be spoken aloud. Her husband, meanwhile, was often away on expeditions or absorbed in his gambling. Their marriage was less a union of hearts and more a partnership of necessity. He needed her money, and she needed his title. Yet this distance gave Almina the freedom to pursue her own interests without constant scrutiny. She hosted dinners where society's most influential men and women gathered, and behind the laughter and music, hushed conversations took place. Ladies leaned close to her, their faces pale with fear, whispering about their daughters, their nieces, their friends. Girls who had made mistakes, women who could not bear another child, aristocrats who risked disgrace if their secrets were revealed. Almina listened with sympathy, her eyes sharp, her mind calculating. Every story was both a tragedy and an opportunity, and she began to weave herself into the hidden fabric of London's most delicate scandals. The Carnarvon name gave her access to the highest circles, but her Rothschild fortune gave her independence. Unlike many women of her era, she was not trapped by her husband's control. This gave her an unusual kind of authority, one she wielded carefully. She knew that society adored appearances but thrived on hypocrisy. The same lords and ladies who condemned scandal in public often participated in it behind closed doors. By positioning herself as both confidante and benefactor, Almina became indispensable. Women trusted her, men feared her, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Hickler Castle became more than just a grand estate. It became a symbol of her double life, a place of glittering respectability hiding the shadows of unspeakable secrets. In the quiet of her chambers, surrounded by silk curtains and the glow of candlelight, Almina sometimes wondered how far she would go. She told herself she acted out of compassion, that she was helping women who had nowhere else to turn, that she was saving lives from ruin. But beneath this, there was something darker, a hunger for control, a fascination with the power that came from handling society's most dangerous secrets. She was no longer the illegitimate daughter begging for acceptance. She was Lady Almina Carnarvon, mistress of Hickler, keeper of confidences, and soon, as whispers would later claim, the hidden patron of one of the most dangerous medical underworlds in Victorian and Edwardian England. Hickler Castle rose like a monument to ambition and secrecy, its stone towers looming over the rolling green of Hampshire. Within its countless rooms, the daily routine of aristocracy unfolded with the grace of a well-rehearsed performance. Servants scurried across polished floors, silver trays clinked softly in drawing rooms, and fireplaces crackled in endless succession. To visitors, the estate radiated a timeless elegance, a reminder of England's grand heritage. But to those who lived within, especially Lady Almina, Hickler was more than a home. It was a stage where every gesture mattered, a fortress where appearances were guarded and whispers could destroy reputations. As mistress of the house, Almina had mastered the art of dual existence, balancing her public role as dutiful wife and philanthropist with her private fascination for the hidden struggles of those society ignored. George Herbert, the Earl of Carnarvon, had little patience for domestic duties. His love for speed and adventure carried him far beyond Hickler's gates. He had a collection of motor cars and a reckless streak that thrilled him but terrified everyone else. On long stretches of country roads, he would drive with abandon, and accidents were frequent. More than once he returned with broken bones, his body marked by the risks he could not resist. These injuries eventually left him in constant pain, which in turn led him to spend increasing amounts of time abroad, particularly in Egypt, where the dry climate offered relief. For Almina, this meant freedom. His absences were long, his distractions numerous, and she could move within London's shadowed networks with little interference. She played the devoted wife when needed, but behind the veneer of loyalty she was weaving a separate narrative that was entirely her own. Inside Hickler, Almina's drawing rooms became centers of influence. She hosted glittering soirees that dazzled the aristocracy, filling the grand halls with music, laughter, and the perfume of exotic flowers. Politicians, bankers, military officers, and noble ladies all flocked to her gatherings. They spoke openly of art, politics, and the empire, but underneath these formal conversations ran a current of more dangerous exchanges. Almina, seated gracefully in embroidered gowns, encouraged confidences. With a tilt of her head or a sympathetic glance, she coaxed the hidden truths from her guests. Women especially felt drawn to her, sensing that she would not judge them as harshly as society did. They leaned close, their words trembling with shame. A daughter in trouble, a secret affair, a child conceived outside the sanctity of marriage. In the glittering rooms of Hickler, these whispered stories mingled with the scent of roses and champagne, unnoticed by the men discussing politics a few feet away. What fascinated Almina was not only the desperation, but also the hypocrisy. Noblemen who condemned sin in Parliament often harbored their own scandals, concealed by their wives or by money paid in silence. Aristocratic women, cloaked in jewels and silk, hid fears of pregnancies that would ruin reputations, marriages, or fortunes. Servants and working-class women fared even worse, forced to hide their bodies from employers and clergymen alike. Almina, positioned between two worlds, neither entirely accepted by the aristocracy nor fully belonging to the Rothschilds, recognized the leverage in these situations. By lending help discreetly, she could command gratitude and loyalty. The more secrets she held, the more untouchable she became. She realized that behind the walls of Hickler, she was building an invisible empire of influence, one no man could see but which extended through every drawing room in London. The castle itself mirrored this duality. By day it sparkled with sunlight pouring through stained glass, its vast dining hall hosting elegant meals, its libraries offering books on every subject. By night, however, its corridors whispered with shadows. Servants carried sealed letters to and from London. Packages arrived under false names, never recorded in the household ledger. Certain rooms, normally unused, became places where women of society came under the cover of dusk, claiming to visit Lady Almina for charitable work. The butler and footmen asked no questions. Their silence was secured with generous bonuses. They suspected, of course, but suspicion meant nothing without proof. Hickler's grandeur cloaked its mistress's secret dealings as effectively as a priest's robe cloaked confession. To her credit, Almina did not act carelessly. She maintained a balance between her public role and her private influence. She continued to fund hospitals, often appearing at wards in immaculate gowns, comforting wounded soldiers and offering her wealth to purchase medicines. The newspapers adored these acts of philanthropy, painting her as an angel of mercy, yet at the same time, certain physicians known for their willingness to cross the boundaries of law found their pockets mysteriously lined, their practices inexplicably protected from police raids. Almina used intermediaries, wealthy men loyal to her or desperate women grateful for her support. She kept herself one step removed from the operations, ensuring that if scandal ever erupted, her name would remain in the shadows. But those who whispered of her involvement also understood that crossing her could mean ruin. Almina had become not merely a hostess, but a patroness of secrets. Her fascination grew not only with the power of silence, but with the stories themselves. She read medical journals in private, studied the history of laws regarding women's bodies, and engaged in quiet discussions with doctors willing to risk careers for the sake of profit or compassion. She was intelligent and absorbed details quickly. When she sat in her boudoir, her fingers trailing along the gilt edges of medical texts, she imagined herself not only as a benefactor, but as someone who truly understood the plight of women. She felt a curious blend of pity and control, sympathy and superiority. It was this mixture that drove her to expand her quiet support. She told herself she was offering dignity where society denied it. But there was also a darker satisfaction in knowing she held the keys to other people's fates. Meanwhile, the world beyond Hickler was shifting. The suffragette movement was rising, demanding rights for women, filling the streets with marches and protests. Newspapers debated morality, doctors debated science, and politicians argued over the boundaries of law and religion. Almina watched these battles with careful eyes. She admired the boldness of the suffragettes, but knew that her own power came not from loud protest, but from quiet manipulation. She would never chain herself to the railings of Parliament, but she could sit in her drawing room and influence those who wrote the laws. She was proof that power for women could take many forms, and hers lay in mastering the art of secrecy. The louder the world roared outside, the more she entrenched herself within the guarded walls of Hickler, protecting her hidden empire of whispered truths. The servants, though loyal, were not blind. They saw ladies arrive pale and desperate, then leave with eyes both relieved and haunted. They carried trunks with unusual weight, heard doctors' footsteps echoing in corridors at odd hours. But money kept them quiet, and fear kept them loyal. No one dared to challenge the mistress of Hickler. Even the Earl, distracted by his expeditions and his own pleasures, asked no questions. His marriage, though not without affection, had become a partnership of convenience. He enjoyed the wealth she brought, she enjoyed the title he gave, and they lived largely independent lives. In many ways, this freedom was Almina's greatest asset. While other wives were bound by their husbands' watchful eyes, she maneuvered in shadows without restraint. By the turn of the century, Lady Almina had transformed Hickler Castle into more than a grand estate. It had become the beating heart of her double life, a palace of splendor and scandal. To the public, she was the gracious countess, adored for her charity. To those in need, she was a lifeline, a woman of compassion who offered hope where none existed. But to herself, in the solitude of her gilded chambers, she was something else entirely, a strategist, a keeper of secrets, a woman who had discovered that the true power of aristocracy did not lie in titles or lands, but in the shadows where reputations could be saved or destroyed. The walls of Hickler held both her triumphs and her sins, and as the years passed, the line between them grew ever thinner. The narrow streets of London told a story very different from the grand halls of Hickler. Fog clung to the cobblestones, gas lamps flickered in the gloom, and hidden behind unmarked doors were places that respectable society pretended not to see. It was in these shadowed alleys that Lady Almina's influence stretched quietly. her money flowing into hands that dared to work in defiance of the law. These were the doctors and midwives who provided services society refused to acknowledge, who took risks that could ruin them if discovered. They were not the white-coated gentlemen celebrated in medical journals, but rather figures living on the edge, men with weary eyes, women hardened by years of secrecy, and apprentices who had seen too much suffering to still believe in innocence. Their clinics were rooms with peeling paint and the smell of disinfectant poorly masking blood, and their tools were worn but efficient. To most of society, they were criminals. To the women who came knocking, they were saviors. The Lady Almina never walked these streets herself. She was far too clever for that. But she knew their geography intimately through letters and reports, through conversations that lasted late into the night with intermediaries she trusted. She paid for discretion, for silence, for the certainty that her name would never appear in a policeman's notebook. Money flowed from her accounts into the hands of these practitioners, enough to keep them in business, enough to bribe the occasional inspector, enough to ensure that if a woman of importance ever found herself in need, there would be a safe place prepared. The irony was that safety was relative. Even with her patronage, these procedures were dangerous, their outcomes uncertain. But compared to the horrors of back-street operators who left women bleeding and abandoned, the doctors Almina supported were considered almost reputable. Almost, she was careful about whom she helped. Not every desperate woman received access to these resources. Almina was strategic. She chose cases that carried influence, names that meant power, families that would owe her favors for life. A viscountess's daughter, a wealthy merchant's wife, a cousin of a political figure, all these women found quiet salvation under her shadow. In return, their families extended gratitude in ways that could not be measured in currency. Promises were made, loyalties secured, doors opened to her influence. It was a dangerous exchange, one that tied people of power to her in bonds of secrecy. She had created a hidden web that stretched across society, connecting her to politicians, bankers, military men, and ladies of status. Each of them held a piece of shame that she had shielded from the public eye, and each of them, in turn, protected her name from scrutiny. The doctors themselves were a mixed group. Some were true believers, men and women convinced that the laws against abortion were cruel relics, that women deserved the right to control their bodies. They saw themselves as pioneers, risking everything for justice. Others were less noble, driven by greed, exploiting desperation for profit. They cared little for safety as long as the payment arrived. Almina navigated between these types with precision, rewarding those who offered skill and discretion while quietly withdrawing support from those who endangered her reputation. She became, in a way, a curator of this hidden medical underworld, ensuring that the most dangerous operators were starved of funds while the more reliable ones thrived. Her involvement was invisible to most, yet essential to the system's survival. Though she never entered the clinics herself, she was not untouched by their realities. She heard stories, horrific tales of women who arrived too late, their bodies broken by botched attempts in darker corners of the city. She read letters written in trembling hands, begging for mercy, describing situations so desperate that even her hardened heart ached. A maid dismissed for dishonor, a married woman terrified of her husband's wrath, a young girl shamed by a predatory uncle. These were the voices that haunted her nights. Almina told herself that she was helping, that her money prevented countless tragedies. But sometimes, when the letters described deaths she could not prevent, she felt the weight of guilt pressing on her. She would lie awake in her chamber at Hickler, the silence of the castle broken only by the ticking of a clock, and wonder whether she had become complicit in something darker than she intended. Still, she could not stop. By this point, too many people relied on her. Doctors expected her payments, families expected her help, and society's most powerful figures depended on her silence. To withdraw would mean exposure, betrayal, perhaps even ruin. So she pressed on, constructing layers of protection around herself. She used intermediaries who never knew her full involvement, and she signed documents under false names. She cultivated alibis that placed her at charity events whenever the most delicate procedures were undertaken. Her skill at deception became as sharp as any politician's. To the public, she was still the benevolent countess, adored for her hospitals and her kindness. Only a select few knew that behind the shimmering facade of Heikler, a network of forbidden medicine thrived under her protection. Her husband, as always, remained distant. He had his own pursuits, his own obsessions, particularly in Egypt, where his fascination with antiquities grew. In his absence, Almina moved more freely, her influence unchallenged within England. If he suspected anything unusual, he never spoke of it. Perhaps he preferred not to know. His own reputation was hardly spotless. His gambling and recklessness had caused enough whispers. Theirs was a marriage of convenience, and both understood that their survival depended on ignoring certain truths. The wider world, however, was beginning to change. Police grew more vigilant, newspapers more daring. A few scandal sheets printed exposes on illegal clinics, describing them in lurid detail, painting their operators as monsters preying on innocent women. Politicians debated harsher punishments. Doctors condemned the practice publicly while some continued privately. Almina read these articles with a mix of anger and fear. She knew that if the wrong thread was pulled, her entire web could unravel. Yet she also knew that her position as countess protected her in ways no ordinary woman could hope for. Who would dare accuse Lady Almina Carnarvon, wife of an earl, benefactress of hospitals, patroness of wounded soldiers, of supporting such forbidden acts? The very idea seemed absurd, and that absurdity was her shield. In private, though, she was less confident. There were times when she looked in the mirror and saw not the polished countess, but the frightened girl who had once begged for acceptance. She feared exposure, feared the ruin that could come with a single careless word. But she also felt exhilaration, a thrill that coursed through her whenever she realized how much power she held. For the first time in her life, she was not at the mercy of others' judgments. She was the one holding secrets, and secrets were stronger than titles, stronger than wealth. They were weapons, and in her hands they could shape the destiny of families and perhaps even of England itself. Thus the dark clinics of London continued to operate, sustained by invisible threads of Rothschild money channeled through the Countess of Carnarvon. Women continued to arrive at unmarked doors, terrified and desperate, and to leave either with their futures salvaged or their bodies broken. And in the grand halls of Heikler, Lady Almina continued to smile, to pour tea, to dazzle at parties, while inside her heart she carried the knowledge that she had become both savior and conspirator in one of the most dangerous games society had ever played. The women came from everywhere. They arrived in polished carriages drawn by matched horses, or in battered cabs whose drivers knew enough to ask no questions. They came cloaked in furs that glittered in the lamplight, or wrapped in plain shawls worn thin by years of labor. Their accents varied, from the refined tones of Mayfair salons to the rough speech of London's East End, but their eyes all carried the same shadows: fear, shame, desperation. These were the women who found themselves trapped by circumstance, by the unforgiving laws of society, by mistakes, or by the violence of men. To the world, they were either scandal waiting to happen or shame to be hidden away. To Lady Almina, they were both the proof of society's hypocrisy and the key to her growing influence. Each story that reached her was different, yet eerily familiar. A baronet's daughter who had been seduced by a family friend, her life in ruins if her condition became known. A married woman with 5 children already, whose body could not endure another birth, but whose husband refused to restrain himself. a scullery maid dismissed from her position for conduct unbecoming, left to fend for herself with no money and a swelling belly, a young girl, scarcely more than a child, whose uncle had claimed her innocence and left her terrified of the shame to come. Their voices came to Almina through letters, through whispered conversations at soirees, through the intermediaries who served as her eyes and ears in the world outside Heikler's golden halls. When she read these accounts, she often felt an ache that surprised her. She had grown up privileged, always protected by her father's wealth and her mother's determination, and yet she recognized in these women a reflection of her own vulnerability. For all her money and her title, she too had once been judged by society for something beyond her control, her birth, her illegitimacy. She remembered the sneers, the whispered insults, the way doors had closed to her. These memories softened her toward the women who sought her help. She told herself she was offering them dignity, sparing them the cruelty of a world that cared more about propriety than compassion. Yet her sympathy did not blind her to opportunity. She understood that each woman she helped added another thread to her invisible network of power. A viscountess whose daughter's secret was preserved would never speak against Almina in society. A politician whose niece was saved from scandal might listen more carefully when Almina expressed her opinions about funding hospitals. A wealthy merchant's wife who left London quietly after her ordeal might ensure her husband's loyalty in business dealings. Even the servants who benefited from her quiet generosity became devoted, their silence guaranteed by gratitude and fear. With each case, Almina's reach extended further, binding families of every rank into her web. The women themselves rarely spoke of what happened after they left the discreet clinics. They returned to their lives, their bodies sore, their eyes haunted, their secrets locked away forever. Some were grateful, sending tokens of appreciation or letters filled with trembling thanks. Others were silent, unable to confront the shame of what they had endured, and some too many, despite the careful doctors she supported, did not survive. Almina tried not to dwell on these tragedies, though she kept their names in a hidden ledger in her study, written in a code only she understood. At night she would sometimes trace her fingers over the ink, as though by acknowledging their existence she could grant them some small measure of remembrance. The irony was that while society condemned these women, it also relied on their silence. The very families who would have cast them out in disgrace, if the truth were known, were often the ones who came knocking at Almina's door in the first place. Hypocrisy wrapped around every case like a shroud. Men who railed against immorality in Parliament delivered their daughters to clinics in secret. Clergymen who thundered against sin from the pulpit whispered confessions to her over brandy in Heikler's library, begging for her assistance with a niece or a parishioner. Almina listened, her face composed, her answers calm. Inside, she marveled at the absurdity of it all. A society so determined to punish women for the consequences of men's desires, yet so desperate to hide those punishments when they struck too close to home. Sometimes she wondered whether the women saw her as savior or accomplice. When they clutched her hands, tears running down their cheeks, she felt the weight of their gratitude. But she also knew that in their darkest hours, some might curse her name, blaming her for the pain, the fear, the cold instruments of the procedure. It was not simple kindness she offered them, but a transaction, hope traded for loyalty, dignity purchased with silence. And yet she believed with fierce determination that what she did was better than leaving them to suffer alone. The law offered them no mercy. She had taken it upon herself to fill the void. Her reputation as a philanthropist made her actions easier to conceal. She was already known for her generosity, her hospitals, her charitable donations. When a woman visited Heikler in secrecy, it could always be explained as another charitable case, another cause for the Countess's compassion. The staff accepted these explanations without question, preferring not to think too deeply, The fewer details known, the safer they were. Almina understood this instinct well. She herself had become adept at compartmentalizing her life, one face for the public, another for the shadows. The women who passed through her orbit left their marks on her, though. She remembered their faces, their trembling voices, their pleas whispered in desperation. She remembered the aristocratic girl who nearly fainted when she realized she had to climb the narrow stairs of a clinic that smelled of disinfectant and fear. She remembered the washerwoman who clutched her rosary so tightly that it left bruises on her palms. She remembered the silence of the married lady who never spoke a word, her eyes hollow, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though enduring a punishment she believed she deserved. These memories haunted Almina, reminding her that for all her power, she was dealing with fragile lives that could break in an instant, and yet she could not stop. By helping them, she became indispensable. She held their secrets in her hands, and they, in turn, secured her place in a society that still whispered about her illegitimacy. No one could dismiss her now, not when so many owed her so much. She had carved a place for herself in the heart of England's most unforgiving circles, not by birthright, but by wielding the one currency more powerful than wealth, silence. And as she moved gracefully through the halls of Hickler, her gowns trailing across marble floors, her eyes bright with practiced charm, no one could have guessed that beneath her elegant exterior beat the heart of a woman who had seen the deepest shadows of human desperation and used them to build her legacy. The whispers began innocently, as whispers always do. At first, they were nothing more than fragments of gossip traded in drawing rooms scented with roses and tobacco smoke. A lady's maid mentioned seeing her mistress leaving Hickler at an odd hour. A coachman swore he had driven a veiled woman into the countryside near a physician's discreet practice. An ambitious journalist caught sight of a titled figure moving furtively through Soho's fog and scribbled a note in his book. Alone, each story was trivial, easily dismissed. Together, they formed a murmur, a hum beneath the polished surface of society life, a sound that grew louder with every passing week. Almina was aware of it, though she pretended not to be. At dinner parties, she caught the fleeting glances, the way conversations shifted as she entered the room. She saw the subtle raising of brows, the almost imperceptible smirks. These were signs she had learned to read long ago, back when she was a girl fighting to be accepted among the aristocracy. But this time the whispers were more dangerous. They no longer targeted her parentage or her wealth. They threatened the foundation of the secret empire she had built in shadows. The society she moved through thrived on scandal, feeding on it like a ravenous beast, yet it feared scandal when it touched its own. Those who had once come to her in desperation now guarded their silence more fiercely than ever, terrified of exposure. Some even sought to distance themselves from her, hoping to erase the memory of what they owed. Almina watched them closely, her eyes sharp, her smile practiced, never betraying her inner calculation. She knew which families had the most to lose, and which were bold enough to risk her downfall if it served their ambition. The danger did not only come from idle gossip. Politics had always shadowed her world, and now whispers of impropriety threatened to become weapons in the hands of men who envied her influence. A reform-minded MP spoke in the Commons about the hidden sins of the upper classes, hinting at clinics where illegal practices were shielded by powerful patrons. His words struck too close to home. Though he never named her, Almina knew the implication was clear. Newspapers picked up the story, careful to remain vague yet eager to stir curiosity. One London paper published an anonymous letter describing a great lady of title who involved herself in dark work unbecoming of her station. The piece spread quickly, and while no one dared to print her name, the careful reader needed little imagination to connect the dots. In Hickler's halls, the atmosphere grew tense. Servants who had long kept their silence now feared what questions might come if officials ever knocked at the gates. Doctors who had accepted her patronage began to hesitate, some withdrawing altogether, worried their licenses might be endangered. Even some of her allies in society grew nervous. An old friend warned her that she was playing too dangerous a game, that one wrong step could bring ruin not only upon her, but upon everyone connected to her. Almina listened, nodding gracefully, but in her heart she refused to retreat. She had not clawed her way into this world only to be cast out by whispers. Instead, she began to fight fire with fire. She summoned journalists to Hickler, entertaining them lavishly, ensuring that stories of her charity hospitals, her generosity to the poor, and her support for wounded soldiers filled the society columns. The narrative of Lady Almina as a benevolent savior drowned out the darker murmurs, at least for a while. She fed society the image it wanted, a glamorous countess whose fortune was matched only by her compassion. Few dared to speak openly against such a figure, lest they appear cruel or envious. Still, the risk remained. Each time she walked into a crowded ballroom, she wondered whether someone would confront her, whether a single name might be spoken aloud to undo her carefully built facade. At night, she lay awake in her great bed beneath embroidered canopies, listening to the silence of the castle, and imagined the sound of a knock at the door, the arrival of constables armed with warrants. She imagined headlines splashed across London papers, her face painted as villainous rather than benefactress. The thought chilled her, but it also hardened her resolve. It was in these restless nights that she began to weave a new strategy. If whispers threatened her, she would drown them not only with good deeds but with secrets of her own. Over the years, she had gathered knowledge, letters from indiscreet lovers, records of debts, private admissions overheard in drunken confidences. She had not sought this power at first, but it had come naturally, a byproduct of her position as confidante and helper. Now she realized that this arsenal of secrets was her strongest defense. If anyone dared expose her, she could expose them in return. The whispers grew bolder one spring when a maid who had once been dismissed from Hickler attempted to sell her story to the press. She claimed to know of women smuggled into the castle under cover of night, of hidden rooms and hushed conversations. The story might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled servant, but Almina acted swiftly. Before the tale could reach print, the maid found herself the subject of an entirely different scandal. Rumors of theft, impropriety, and betrayal spread so effectively that her credibility vanished. No paper would buy her words after that. Almina had protected herself, but the incident left her shaken. For every silenced maid, for every gossip column diverted, there remained the looming possibility of discovery. The women she helped were grateful, but gratitude could sour into resentment. A single indiscretion, a careless word, could unravel everything. Society was fickle. The same voices that praised her today would condemn her tomorrow if it suited them, and so the Countess moved ever more carefully, each gesture calculated, each smile measured. She knew the whispers would never cease entirely. They were the price she paid for playing her dangerous game. But she also knew that fear could be turned into power, that suspicion could be used to bind others to her cause. For as long as the truth remained unspoken, she remained untouchable, balanced on a knife's edge, a figure both admired and feared, the elegant lady whose secrets threatened to topple dynasties if ever they escaped her grasp. The price of silence was never paid in gold alone. Money bought the doctors, the carriages, the hidden rooms, but money could not secure absolute loyalty. For that, Almina relied on something far more precious, her ability to bind people with fear, gratitude, and obligation. Over the years, she had perfected this art, learning when to offer a kind hand and when to remind others of the cost of betrayal. It was a delicate balance, a constant calculation of risk and reward, and she carried it out with the poise of a woman who had long ago understood that survival in her world meant never leaving anything to chance. The families who came to her learned quickly what was expected. They arrived in desperation, trembling with shame, and they left with their reputations intact. But their silence was secured not only by relief, it was cemented by the unspoken knowledge that Almina knew too much. She never threatened openly, never raised her voice. She did not need to. The mere weight of her gaze across a ballroom, the arch of her brow at a dinner table, was enough to remind them of the fragile line separating discretion from disgrace. Every father who begged her to intervene for his daughter, every mother who clutched her hand in relief afterward, understood instinctively that gratitude was not optional, it was binding. Almina had her allies, but she also had her ledger. In the locked drawer of her private study, behind the ornate desk carved from oak, she kept a book filled with careful notations. No names appeared in full, only initials, dates, and symbols, enough for her to recall each story if ever she needed. The ledger was her insurance policy, her shield against betrayal. On sleepless nights she would open it, running her fingers across the ink, remembering each case, the earl whose household would have collapsed if his sister's indiscretion had become known, the wealthy merchant whose wife nearly died in the hands of a backstreet practitioner before Almina intervened, the bishop who begged her to erase the shame that threatened his family's piety. Their secrets lay in her hands, and as long as they feared her knowledge, they would never dare expose her. But silence required more than fear, it demanded constant payment. Doctors were discreet, but discretion came at a price. Each year the sums grew larger, as those who risked their careers demanded more for their loyalty. Almina paid without hesitation, her fortune stretched thin but her pride unyielding. She funded private hospitals, paid for the education of physicians' children, and even purchased land in the countryside to serve as rest homes for women recovering under assumed names. All of this cost more than her inheritance could comfortably sustain, yet she never faltered. She knew the moment she withheld her generosity was the moment someone might decide their silence was worth selling. There were moments when even she felt the strain. The accounts she managed late into the night revealed the bleeding of her wealth, and though Heichler gleamed with the opulence of aristocracy, she knew that much of its splendor rested on a fragile foundation. There were days when she wondered whether she had gone too far, whether she had entangled herself in a web so vast that even she could no longer control it. But then another desperate family would arrive, another girl's tear. Stained face would plead before her, and she would remember why she endured it. She had become indispensable. Her role was not merely one of savior or sinner, it was one of power, a power built on secrets too dark for the light of day. The cost was not only financial. Emotionally, the burden weighed on her. For every grateful sigh, there was a death rattle that echoed in her memory. Not all the women she helped survived, and though she had chosen careful physicians, medicine was imperfect, and danger always lurked. Sometimes she learned of their deaths weeks later, a curt letter informing her that the patient expired of fever, or complications arose. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces, felt their desperation. She told herself she was doing what mercy demanded, that without her intervention even more lives would be lost to cruelty and secrecy. But in the still hours before dawn, her conscience was not so easily soothed. Whispers of scandal never ceased, though she kept them at bay. When rumors grew louder, she paid off newspapers with charitable donations. When servants grew curious, she sent them away with generous pensions that silenced questions. When allies faltered, she reminded them gently of all they stood to lose. It was an endless performance, a dance in which one misstep could mean ruin. Yet Almina excelled at the dance. She had been performing all her life, first as the illegitimate child clawing for recognition, then as the countess who dazzled society, now as the hidden patroness of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Her husband's family remained largely ignorant of the depths of her involvement. They knew she poured money into hospitals, that she was unusually sympathetic toward women's causes, that she entertained visitors whose presence was not always explained. But they did not ask. Perhaps they preferred ignorance, for to ask might have required acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths. Almina used their silence to her advantage, moving in the shadows while maintaining her glittering facade. The most dangerous moment came when one of her own doctors, embittered by his dwindling profits, threatened exposure. He hinted to a rival that he possessed letters tying Almina to his work, letters that could ruin her if revealed. The threat reached her ears within days. She did not hesitate. Summoning the doctor to Heikler, she met him in her private chambers, where her voice was soft, her demeanor calm. She reminded him of the patients whose gratitude he enjoyed, the debts he had accumulated, the indiscretions she had quietly erased on his behalf. Then she handed him a sealed envelope, money, yes, but more importantly, a note that made clear her knowledge of his personal secrets. He left pale, subdued, his threats silenced. She never heard of his defiance again. It was in these moments that Almina realized fully the cost of her chosen path. She was not merely funding compassion, she was managing an empire of shadows. Every favor granted, every silence purchased, tied her deeper into the web. There was no turning back. She was too entangled, too reliant on the very secrets that might one day destroy her. Yet she pressed on, because to stop was unthinkable. To stop was to admit defeat, to invite exposure, to let the whispers grow into shouts. As she stood on the balcony of Heikler, looking out over the manicured gardens bathed in moonlight, she often wondered how history would remember her. Would she be the countess who saved women from ruin, the benevolent patroness whose compassion transcended the cruelty of her age? Or would she be painted as a schemer, a woman who manipulated suffering for her own gain, who built her power on the backs of the desperate? She did not know. What she did know was that in her time, in her world, silence was the most valuable currency, and she had become its unrivaled banker. Legacies are rarely what we intend them to be. Lady Almina had spent her life weaving a story of power and compassion, of secrets held in her gilded hands. Yet as the years passed and the faces around her changed, she began to see how fragile her empire truly was. The aristocracy, with its grand houses and rigid hierarchies, had always thrived on appearances, but appearances could shift with the changing tide of history. Wars reshaped nations, fortunes vanished, reputations collapsed, and what once seemed permanent could dissolve like mist under the morning sun. Almina knew this truth better than most, for she had built her influence not on the foundation of lineage, but on the precarious ground of silence and shadows. The ledger in her drawer grew thicker with each passing year. She still kept it locked, still traced its entries when sleep refused to come, but as she aged, it seemed less like a shield and more like a burden. The women she had helped were no longer fresh in her memory. Their names blurred together, their faces fading into the haze of recollection, yet their stories clung to her. She remembered the trembling hands, the desperate voices, the haunting eyes. Some of those women had gone on to live lives of respectability, their secrets buried with them. Others had not been so fortunate, lost to illness, to scandal, to the relentless cruelty of a world that offered little mercy. Almina had been their savior, but she had also been their confessor, carrying their sins and sorrows into her own soul. By the time the new century dawned, society itself had begun to shift. Conversations about women's rights, about suffrage, about reform became louder. What had once been unspeakable began to be discussed in hushed tones, then in public debate. The laws that had condemned so many women to desperation were questioned, and some even dared to demand change. Almina watched these developments with fascination and unease. Part of her longed for a world where women would not have to beg in secret, where their choices would not be criminalized. Yet part of her knew that such a world would also strip her of her power. Her influence was bound to silence, to secrecy. If the silence broke, what place would she hold? Heikler remained a stage upon which she played her role flawlessly. Visitors came and went, marveling at the grandeur of the castle, praising the generosity of its mistress. She hosted politicians, artists, doctors, even royalty, each entertained with grace and charm. To them she was the very embodiment of noble benevolence, a woman whose fortune was used for the betterment of society. They saw her hospitals, her donations, her endless energy for causes that appeared pure and unsuspected, or pretended not to suspect, the darker work she had overseen, the lives she had touched in ways that could never be acknowledged openly. The irony was that her greatest strength, her control over secret, also ensured her story would never be told in full. Those who knew the truth were bound too tightly to ever speak it. The women she had helped were too fearful, too grateful, or too long gone. The families who had depended on her discretion had every reason to keep their silence. Even her doctors, whether bought, persuaded, or intimidated, carried their knowledge to their graves. History, she realized, would never record the full extent of her actions. It would either erase them entirely or reduce them to whispers of rumor, easily dismissed by those who preferred to believe in the myth of her benevolence. Almina sometimes wondered if she regretted it. There were nights when the weight of her choices pressed so heavily upon her that she felt she could scarcely breathe. The memory of the young girls, the cries that echoed in her mind, the few failures that had ended in death, they haunted her like ghosts. Yet she also remembered the mothers who clasped her hands with gratitude, the daughters whose reputations were saved, the families whose futures were secured. Perhaps her legacy was not one of simple morality, but of complexity, an acknowledgement that in a cruel and hypocritical society, mercy itself could take the form of sin. Her later years were quieter, though the whispers never truly ceased. Guests still speculated, servants still wondered, journalists still tried to glimpse behind her polished facade, but by then Almina had grown untouchable. She was too old, too respected, too entrenched in the mythology of the Carnarvon name. Even if someone dared to expose her, few would believe it, and fewer still would dare repeat it. She had outlived the danger, if not the memories. When she walked through the gardens of Heikler in those twilight years, cane in hand, she sometimes imagined the voices of all those women trailing behind her, unseen but never absent. They were the true measure of her life, not the titles, not the wealth, not even the castle that stood so proudly against the horizon. They were her hidden legacy, scattered across generations, living quietly in families that never knew how close they had come to ruin. And though the world would never write their names, she carried them with her to the end. In the final silence, Almina understood that her life had been a paradox. She had been both savior and manipulator, both angel and shadow. She had saved lives by breaking laws, secured reputations by burying truth, built her power by exploiting desperation. History would never fully know her, because history preferred its women simple, saint or sinner, never both. But she had been both, and in that complexity lay the truth of who she was. The countess who had mastered the currency of silence, who had turned society's hypocrisy into her throne, who had lived a life balanced on the edge of scandal yet had never once fallen. And so her story ended, not in exposure, not in disgrace, but in the quiet endurance of a woman who had navigated the impossible. She left behind a dynasty polished with respectability, a castle that glittered with grandeur, and a legacy written not in stone but in shadows, shadows that whispered of the desperate, the forgotten, the women whose voices had been silenced but whose lives had been forever shaped by the clandestine mercy of Lady Almina Carnarvon.